What I want to do today is just kind of walk through together. I want to make this interactive, really. How we interpret an open-ended verse from Scripture in such a way that we make sense of this. Because we're kind of dwelling here, I would say, on the boundary between myth, legend, and history. And one of the things I think when you're reading Genesis that's really challenging is to kind of think about that boundary. It's sort of like, have you ever had that experience where you're like halfway falling asleep and then you kind of snap to and you're just not quite sure if what's real or what's not? Like you were on the boundary of falling asleep and dreaming. And there's something of that quality to these early chapters in Genesis. There's a lot happening. There's a lot that's not explained. And, one of the really challenging aspects of biblical interpretation is to kind of figure out, sort of how these elements that are on that boundary come into then being part of what we would say is the normal stream of history. And what are things that are, just so open-ended that you really can't give a fixed meaning to them. But people try, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how people try. So the question that we're going to really think about today is, what does this mark of Cain mean? And if possible, what does it have to do with us today? Does it have any relevance to anything about Fisher's Island these days? Okay, so before we begin, maybe we'll just take a quick thought, what do you all think the mark of Cain was? If you read this verse and you just had to think what this was, what would you imagine it would be? Just out of curiosity.
Some physical deformity?
A deformity? Yeah,
a mark like a tattoo on his face.
Tattoo? Yeah. I think those are very reasonable answers. Anyone else? Of course, it also begs the question of what kind of tattoo?
Not a nice one.
Well, so one of the things that's kind of interesting is to go to Jewish interpretation of Scripture, sometimes called the Midrash, and to reflect on sort of what Jewish scholars have thought about this, because obviously this is a part of Scripture that we have in common. And the Jewish interpretation of Scripture stretches way back into the sort of early rabbinic periods, in 100, 200, 300, 400, those, early years. So same period of time in which Christianity was developing its understanding of Scripture as well. And so thinking about the Midrash, here's a summary of 7 different ways that have become standard in Jewish tradition. And I'm taking this from the commentary of Rabbi Yitzchak Arama on the Torah. So the first is, maybe the mark was the sun. So there's some speculation that maybe there was a ray of light hitting Cain, and that his face was illuminated in some way. And this does happen in Scripture. It happens with Moses and others who encounter God. When you speak with God face to face, you sort of become illuminated, right? So that, it kind of glow. So that maybe Cain was now glowing, and maybe this was a form of enlightenment. So that's an interesting thought. But some of the rabbis thought that was too favorable towards Cain, that doesn't really make sense of this kind of, in a sense, branding of Cain, you might think. So they thought, well, maybe Cain actually was given something like leprosy, which I think goes back to your, physical deformity. Maybe Cain was suddenly covered in spots, and so such horrible spots that you would want to, if you saw someone all covered in leprous, spots, you probably would not want to go around and assail this person. You'd probably just run away because you don't want to get sick yourself. That kind of makes sense to a certain extent, right? So another one was that Cain was given a dog. So this is a rabbinic theory that Cain was given an animal, a dog, to guide him, so that the mark was that Cain suddenly has this animal that will, he's spiritually blind, so he needs an animal to guide him through life so that the animal can guide him into the right paths. And so he's given a kind of divine companion, and then the animal will also chase away anyone that comes after Cain. I don't know if you think that's far-fetched. And then we've got 3 that have to do with horns.
I was thinking about horns.
Were you thinking about horns?
Yep.
I think that's impressive, Laura. Several of the rabbis thought that Cain grew a horn. But then the question was, what kind of horn? So some thought that he was given like a spiritual horn. The idea was that there was some kind of maybe ghostly horn that he could move around, and in that way it helped him to carve a path through sort of misleading philosophies, ideas that had led him into this murderous path, so that now he has a horn that kind of will divide truth from falsity. But other rabbis say that's way too spiritual. He actually did grow a real horn, and if people charged him, then he would lower his head and he'd had a horn, and so like they would stay away. You're not buying that one. And then there were others that basically said that the horn was there because it was a sign of a sinner who had repented. I don't really recognize that as a sign, but maybe in those days it was. And, you know, I think that thinking about all these different ways of thinking about it, one thing that you find that they don't mention is a tattoo. Although and that's partly because later in the Bible, there is a prohibition on tattooing. So it wouldn't make sense for God to be tattooing people if later in Leviticus he says don't get a tattoo. So, although there is also a tradition that a divine letter was printed on the forehead. So maybe a little bit of contradiction, but when you read rabbinical commentaries, they're always contradicting each other, so there's nothing special about that. So those are old ideas about what this could be. None of them are particularly satisfying, I would say. And you could turn to art history. So, you know, this has been a subject, you know, Cain killing Abel in many works of art. But interestingly, the follow-up to that sort of dramatic episode of murder, this sort of mark of Cain, is only rarely been depicted in art history. According to an author, Ruth Milenkoff, she wrote a book called The Mark of Cain. She only found 2 illustrations in medieval art or sort of early Renaissance art, 1400s, of this episode. One was at the Camposanto Monumentale in Pisa, and as I understand it, it was actually destroyed in World War II. But there's a picture of it, and so you can sort of focus in, and there's a sort of scene. It's one of those narratives that kind of, you know, it's basically all of chapter 4, but it's in like one painting, so you just kind of follow from left to right as you see the narrative unfold. And then at one point, God is like raising a hand, and there's a light going out to mark Cain. So it seems like it is a kind of illumination, the way that they thought about that in this particular illustration. But what she says is the mark of Cain, or the marking of Cain's body, is a theme that was not frequently represented in the visual arts, unlike the cursing of Cain by the Lord. And so I think partly maybe the reason it wasn't represented is, you know, it was still kind of unclear what had happened. I don't know. Or maybe it just wasn't quite as dramatic, but you know, artists won't necessarily be able to help us here because there haven't been too many depictions. So in the 19th century, you know, we kind of turned to rationalist interpretations of the Bible. So now people are trying to make sense of what this was from like an anthropological perspective. So no longer like the rabbinic perspective where they're trying to like figure out what God might have done, but now the question is, what would this have done as a, you know, how would this have functioned anthropologically? Why would this have been mentioned here in the Bible? And James Frazer, who of course you know is like one of the people that really worked on folklore, and he wrote a whole 3-volume series on folklore in the Bible. He thought, and I'm sure you're going to love this one, he thought that it was a tattoo, but the purpose of that tattoo was to ward off Abel's ghost. Now the reason is, like you heard when HP was reading about this, that the blood was crying out, and that's how God knew that Abel had been murdered, right? That's, you know, I mean, we have to presume that God already knew, but the point is in the Bible that the blood is crying out from the ground. And so again, this is on that borderline of like dream and reality. So if the blood is crying out from the ground, then you need something to ward off this angry ghost. That's probably your number one fear, is that this ghost is coming after you. So this is what Fraser has to say about this. This explanation of the mark of Cain has the advantage of relieving the biblical narrative from a manifest absurdity. For on the usual interpretation, God affixed the mark of Cain to save him from human assailants, apparently forgetting that there was nobody to assail him, since the earth was as yet only inhabited by the murderer himself and his parents.
Oh my gosh.
So that is true. There's all these references to other people and cities being formed and things like that. Again, I would not look for a strictly rational explanation of all this. The pieces are there, and we have to kind of make sense of what the pieces are. And they can be instructive, but maybe not as a totality. And I think that's actually important. One thing that I would say about the difference between like a legend and the biblical narrative is that legends tie up everything really, really tightly. So like, one reason to tell a mythological story is to explain things, right? To give sort of an etiology or like a reason that this came into being. And so you tightly connect all the pieces. There's a literary theorist named Erich Auerbach. I don't know if that name is familiar to you. This is a slight excursion, but Auerbach was exiled in Istanbul during World War II. He didn't have his books around him, but he was working on a major project called Mimesis, the Representation of Reality in Western Literature. And he wrote this wonderful introductory chapter on the difference between Homer and the Bible. And he focused particularly on something that's actually very relevant to our conversation. In Homer, there's this episode of the Odysseus having a scar. The scar is on his head, and it gets recognized. And then there's a whole backstory about why this scar came into being, where it was. Every single detail is explained, so that the entire narrative is very tightly wrapped and clear. And what Auerbach says is the Bible's completely the opposite. Bible just throws things in there and no explanation whatsoever and just moves on. And he says that's because in the biblical understanding of reality, these, just like we would, when we go out in the world and things happen, they just note down what happened. And the assumption is, as a witness to something, you're not going to know all the details. I mean, the only reason you can know all the details is if you stand above it as the kind of divine narrator and are able to see a 360 perspective. But when you're in the Bible and you're recording these events, you record them as they happen. Just like, this weird thing happened. Surely there's an explanation for it, but I'm going to write down what I know, even if I can't tell you the whole explanation. And that is a greater form of realism than the idea of that you can get a 360 perspective on anything. So what Auerbach said is that the fact that we can't fill in all the details is actually because the Bible presumes that this really did happen in a way that the Homeric legends didn't. Anyway, that's an excursus on that, a little literary theory. But coming back to Fraser, so what Fraser says is, this is another quote from him. "We may smile if we please at these quaint fancies of vengeful ghosts, shrieking gore, and the earth opening her mouth to drink blood or to vomit out her guilty inhabitants. Nevertheless, it is probable that these and many other notions equally unfounded have served a useful purpose in fortifying respect for human life by the adventitious aid of superstitious terror. The venerable framework of society rests on many pillars, of which the most solid are nature, reason, and justice. Yet at certain stages of its slow and laborious construction, it could ill have dispensed with the frail prop of superstition. If the day should ever come when the great edifice has been carried to completion and reposes in simple majesty on adamantine foundations, it will be possible, without risk to its stability, to cut away and destroy the rotten timbers that shored it up in the process of building." The point there is that this is, from Fraser's perspective, a kind of strange mythological episode, but it serves a useful purpose, which is, if you kill someone, their blood is going to rise up from the ground and chase after you until it gets vengeance. And that's useful because then that discourages people from attacking other people. Maybe in the future we'll have better structures and we can get rid of that idea, but that's what they thought back then. That is a classic anthropological point of view, especially from the 19th century. or early 20th. But there you go. That's his understanding, which is even stranger than the rabbis. Now, if we come back to North America, we get a really problematic understanding of the mark of Cain. Can you, and if you know our history, you can guess where this one's going, right?
Yeah. Slavery.
Slavery. And what do they think the mark of Cain was?
Black skin.
Blacks, 100% right. So there is a long tradition of understanding the mark of Cain as Cain was white and God turned him black. And the interesting thing about this was, and this is a quotation from Robert Van Voorst, who wrote a book called Commonly Misunderstood Verses of the Bible. He said, one particular idea about the mark of Cain held that it is black skin. This seems obviously racist today, but until recently it was a widespread notion. From the 1600s into the 1900s, many Americans and Europeans thought that Cain's mark was black skin and that all black people are Cain's spiritual descendants and under a divine curse. For example, the 10th president of the Latter-day Saints Church, Joseph Fielding Smith Jr., wrote in 1931, "It was well understood by the early elders of the Mormon Church that the mark which was placed on Cain and which was his posterity was inherited as black skin." And this was only let go as a doctrine in the Mormon Church until 1978. And he goes on to say this was not just distinctive to Mormons. I mean, it was kind of a shared belief that the Mormons adopted. But think about that. Up until 1978, this is what people thought the mark of Cain was. So, I mean, this is again why thinking through this and really trying to struggle with these issues can be important, because if you get stuck in an interpretive tradition like that, it can cause serious and real problems.
Yeah, just one
Yeah.
point. So you said people thought,
Yeah.
and I would just question whether people thought, using that word, or whether in reality people used it to justify a course of action, so they needed justification, as opposed to they thought, they rationalized.
Yeah. I think that's that makes a lot of sense to think about that way. It wasn't necessarily that this was something they came to with free of beliefs, free of preconceptions, and they just said, oh, this is what it must be. But they retroactively used this verse to justify an existing opinion. Yeah, I think that makes 100% sense. So, fortunately, I think that has faded away. Like, that is not an interpretation that, I mean, it's interesting. When any of us thought about what this was, nobody, I think, in this room had that thought. So obviously, it's kind of gone from even common perception to something that we have to reject. It's kind of faded away. But still, it's amazing how close that was to our own era right now in terms of an interpretive tradition. So what do people nowadays think? Well, here's a quotation from an evangelical pastor. Can you guess what this evangelical pastor is going to say? What it was? The mark of Cain? I feel like you're really good at guessing. So if you were an evangelical and you had to think about what the mark of Cain was, what would you think it would be?
You were a bastard.
What?
You were a bastard.
Well, I don't think so. Not quite on this one, but maybe some do. I don't know. So here's the guy that wrote a book called Back Porch Theology. He's a Methodist pastor and apparently gathers together with people to talk about some of these passages. And so he says, what in the world was the mark of Cain? What did God do to mark him? Was this the world's first tattoo and God did it? One thing for sure, the mysterious mark had to be visible. It wouldn't be covered by his clothing. It had to be visible, like on his face, his forehead, or someplace obvious to passersby so they wouldn't attack him. Would you allow me liberty to take a guess? Thank you, I'm going to do it anyway. It's a very informal book. I believe God put a tattoo of a cross on Cain's forehead. It was a prophetic type of that yet to come. In that time of Christ, the cross was a symbol of death. Now, post-resurrection, the cross is a symbol of life. People have crosses hanging around their necks or from their earlobes. And I think Cain's mark was a cross for all to see. It couldn't be missed. I mean, it's a sweet idea. My question about that would be, back, at sort of the origins of humanity. Let's assuming there are other people around. They saw a cross on someone's head. I mean, that takes a lot of interpretive work to figure out what in the world this is. It doesn't really make any sense in terms of the narrative itself. but it's a kind of sweet idea, I guess, retrospectively putting a cross on Cain's head. There is also, this may interest you, a very large number of people that think that it has to do with the mark of being a vampire. Now, the reason is, and this is where people don't read the Bible well enough. So, you know, in popular culture, people read the Bible, they pull up little verses like this, they make a big to-do about it, but then they don't read the rest of the Bible, so they don't know what's going on, and their interpretation doesn't necessarily make any sense. So, people that read this think, okay, well, this mark was put on Cain because he was covered in blood, right? You know, from killing his brother, and he seems to have then wandered the earth, and maybe he lived forever, wandering the earth with blood on it. Now, the problem is, Cain did actually not live forever, but you have to go through the rest of chapter 4 to actually understand what happened. In that strange episode about Lamech, the presupposition there is that what Lamech was talking about, and again, this is an interpretive move, so you can argue with this. What Lamech was talking about when he said that he killed someone was that he actually killed Cain. That this was the 7th generation, and so this kind of sevenfold vengeance. Well, it waited 7 generations, and then Lamech himself, in the rabbinic reading of this, by accident, Lamech was blind. He was out with his son Tubal-Cain, who was the one who invented like iron. So he invented how to make a bow with a tip. He thought he saw someone moving in the background, maybe an animal that he was going to kill. So then Tubal-Cain shot and killed what turned out to be Cain. And then Lamech was so upset that he clapped his hands and killed Tubal-Cain, which is why he was saying to his wife, "I've killed a man for wronging me and a young man for injuring me." Make of that interpretation what you will, but Cain did die in the Bible. He didn't wander the earth forever. Although there is some connection between this legend of Cain and the legend of the eternally wandering Jew, which is like another extra biblical story, but that comes from the New Testament, not from the Old Testament, and we won't get into it. But they've been fused from the popular imagination. So some people think, oh, this is about the first vampire, but the book that I was looking at out of that theory says there's no substantial evidence, of course not, to substantiate this. The main reason for this misconception comes from the mistaken assumption that the mark of Cain was in fact a curse of immortality. But I will say that's a happy Halloween legend if you want to talk about it. So I would say just in the end, this has become like what we might call a free-floating signifier. This is a contemporary interpreter who says, the divine description of Cain's shame has become a free-floating signifier whose significance is determined historically and culturally. The meanings of the mark of Cain thus proliferate endlessly in this sermon as elsewhere in the church, resisting any attempt to secure a single authoritative interpretation. And I think I'll pause there. I think there's more to say, but I don't want to belabor the point on this, except to say that when we interpret Scripture, there's one thing it's helpful to go to the history of interpretation, because, we are not, of course, the first people to be reading the Bible. There's been many, many, many generations before us that have read these same passages and try to puzzle over these mysteries. So one thing I would say is if you come across a passage like this and you're wondering what it's about, a first step might be to read what others thought it was about. Now, that said, as you read through what others thought it was about, there's some that seem like obviously wrong, immoral, problematic, and that gives you a perspective, maybe saying this is what it definitely isn't. And I think sometimes when you say what it definitely isn't, it can guide you a little bit better towards what it might be. So that's actually a helpful start in the right direction. But the other thing is, we sometimes have to leave space for the fact that we will just never fully understand, and maybe it's better not to say, what the mark of Cain was. I'll leave though with one thought about this, which is, do you think the mark of Cain was fundamentally negative, or essentially positive. What's your feeling about it?
I would say positive because it was like to protect him after, like if he's done his time or his penance, not to be murdered.
Yeah, exactly. So that it was there to protect him, and it was an act of mercy on God's part to provide this because Cain was worried without it that he would just be killed right away, right?
But does the mark actually have to be a physical mark? Can't it just have been his protection?
So I think you're absolutely right, and it's Louisa. This is really interesting because you've connected. I passed over some passages just to keep us without going way over time, but there are some who say like this may be more like mark my words. So like when for example, like if someone were in trouble and I say mark my words, if you injure this person, I'm coming after you. Like that's not an actual mark. But it is the words being spoken as a way, we say, of marking that person out and saying, don't mess around with this person because this person is under my protection. So I think that's a possibility. But that would also be on the fundamentally positive side, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there is an interpretive strand where it's seen as negative, like it's basically a form of branding. And there are lots and lots of traditions around the world in which if you commit a crime, you're branded for committing that crime, right? And then people won't associate with you because they know instantly when they see you that you're a criminal. And so I think one of the other questions you have to ask when you're looking at this is exactly this: fundamentally positive, fundamentally negative, maybe in between. But again, it will help you to guide your understanding of what this enigmatic mark might mean. And I'd say for us today, what we might want to think about is, again, reading passages like this. There's an invitation for us to connect it with our lives, but we should always make that connection a little loose and tentative because, we can certainly look back and say, it's horrible the way that people connected this with race. But, we also have ideas floating around in our head that probably we'll look back on, generations ahead of us will look back on and say, like, can you believe they thought this? So, I think that we have to think about carefully when we do this to always be tentative in our biblical interpretation. I don't think that's a problem for us as a church, like our church, but it's certainly a problem for some aspects of the Christian church where they fix these interpretations and then they start using them in really like decisive ways that can be harmful.
Don't you think the language too, however they interpret the language, and we're reading it in English, but what the word, just simply what the word may meant, could
Yeah.
that might, can?
Yeah. No, and if you're right, I mean, I skipped over trying to parse through the Hebrew verbs with you all, but you're absolutely right. If you want to like do a more rigorous interpretation, you're going to work with the Hebrew here, and then you're going to work with, the Hebrew that was prevalent at that period rather than, rabbinic Hebrew or contemporary Hebrew, obviously. So there's a lot of work to try to figure this out. But I would say even with that, even with the articles I read on this topic, nobody really knows. I mean, there's no answer to it. You can read many scholarly articles on it now. People come up with their opinions, but there's no consensus.
ChatGPT?
Well, probably you could give us a good summary of like all the different opinions, at least that. So I'll end there, and thank you all for working through this verse with me.